There are no native non-human primate species in the United States, and most recent available data suggests the numbers below. So use in laboratories is huge. 113,269 monkeys are used annually in the US. Thanks everyone for being here. It's very weird to give virtual presentations and not be in the room with everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I really love this event. I'm really grateful to the organizers and all the speakers for their contributions. I just think it's such an important event and great for everybody to be able to get together and just share ideas and share tactics and all of those great things. All right, so yeah, my name is Liz Tyson-Griffin. I'm Programs Director for Born Free USA. I've been lucky enough to present at this conference, I think 5 or 6 times over the years since I think the first time in 2011, working for various different organizations and causes over that time. But I think the thread that has run through my work for the last 20 years is the rescue of primates. Monkeys in particular, and work with them in sanctuaries, as well as campaigning for them and their rights and protection. So this presentation is about 1,200 young monkeys. I had really hoped that by the time it came around to give this presentation, after I'd applied to give the presentation a few months ago, that I would have some really good news on this, and we might already have some of these monkeys at our sanctuary. But you'll learn throughout this presentation the challenges that we faced along the way. And really what I want to do today is talk through this whole saga of why we've got 1,200 monkeys that we're trying to rescue, where they came from, what's happened to them, and then talk about what we can perhaps all do to help move this really important campaign forward. So let me begin with an overview. Okay, so September 2022, Born Free, the organization I work for, was approached by the US Department of Justice to see if our sanctuary, which is based in South Texas, where we care for currently 241 monkeys, including Felix, who's on the right here, to ask if our sanctuary could house 360 juvenile long-tail macaques. So these are babies. They were between 2 and 4 years old. They should be with their mothers. At the time, we had no context as to where they were coming from or what was going on, and the story unfolded over the next couple of months. So the macaques had allegedly been imported illegally by a major lab company called Charles River Laboratories, which I'm sure some of you who work on vivisection will be very familiar with. After months of discussion, the figure for the number of animals in need of rescue rose to 1,200. So a huge number of animals in need of care. And this presentation will chart, as I say, the story so far and the fight that lies ahead. All right, I want to just cover off these might be basics that everybody already knows, but I just want to flag it because I think it's a really important element of what we're talking about here. So captive bred versus free living. I know so many of you are doing amazing work around farmed animals and domesticated animals. So just to kind of flag this for those who are perhaps not familiar with working with wild animals. So all non-human primates, all monkeys, all apes, apart from humans, are wild animals. Domestication of animals is a process which happens, and this is rightly or wrongly, there isn't time now to talk about whether domestication is ethical or right, but domestication changes animals genetically from their ancestors. It's a human-led process where humans deliberately breed animals to express traits that are attractive to them, which is why we have all sorts of issues with dogs with breathing issues and all sorts of other things. That's a whole other subject, of course. So basically, to put it as simply as I can, the dog who lives with you in your home is no longer the same animal as a wolf, either genetically, behaviorally, or biologically. Now, no non-human primate, even if they have been born in captivity over generations, for example, in the zoo trade, none of them have ever been domesticated, and so they retain all their wild traits, and that has really serious implications for their welfare when they're held captive. So as a result, all captive primates suffer when held in captivity, and I say that even for the best of sanctuaries. So I say that even for the sanctuary that I run, we are not providing the life that they deserve. We are doing the absolute best we can with the resources we have, but they are not living the life they deserve in sanctuaries. And then, of course, when you add on top of that the cruelties of zoos, where they're kept on display for their entire lives, they have nowhere to hide from this constant stream of visitors. The pet trade, where usually they're kept in complete isolation and kept in entirely inappropriate conditions, and vivisection, where, of course, they're just literally tortured. They suffer in countless different ways, not just because of their captivity, but because of what they're then exploited for. So I want to have a look at primate populations in the United States to give you a bit of a scale. I'm not sure, yes, I mentioned I work for Born Free USA. My accent throws people off, but I'm based in Texas here. So I'm talking about the United States in particular today. So there are no native non-human primate species in the United States, and most recent available data suggests the numbers below. So use in laboratories is huge. 113,269 monkeys are used annually in the US. Now, while, of course, we want an end to all vivisection, all animals need to be out of labs, we've seen a move in recent years for some countries to at least limit the use of primates. And I think that's because the human-centric view of looking at primates is more important than fish or mice or rats because they're so like us. But we have seen moves towards them being reduced in their use in labs. The exception of this is the US and another couple of countries where their use is actually increasing. So with a huge number of primates in labs right now. In zoos, there are at least 14,352. That's likely to be extremely conservative because there's little transparency with zoos and we don't have access to their full animal lists. So we don't really know how many are in there. That's gleaned from available public information. And the pet trade, again, highly unregulated, very difficult to say how many primates are part of it, but our best estimate is around 15,000. And then I want you to consider how many are in sanctuaries, 1,500. Now, you can see just from this, and I'll talk about this a bit more, that sanctuary has so little opportunity to rescue because of funding, because of capacity. So we're not even scratching the surface of these trades for sanctuary. And that's something that I'll return back to. Free living monkeys, surprisingly enough, while there are no native species, there are some free living monkeys, which I'll talk about briefly now. So where do they come from? Primates in laboratories, captive bred, and also about 30,000 imported every single year from abroad. And that's the key point in this presentation, really, that we'll be talking about. Primates kept and used in zoos, predominantly bred in captivity in zoo facilities, purely to be put on display for the rest of their lives. Those used as pets, bred in captivity purely to make money, to sell to people, but also the legal trade in primates as pets across the US. And this is true for any country that allows the keeping of wild animals. This masks the illegal trade in the same animals. So, for example, there's been reports in the last couple of months of spider monkeys being illegally imported across the Mexican border. And if they can get past the border, then they just dissipate into the legal trade and no one wants to know. Those cared for in sanctuaries, they come from being surrendered or seized pets. They're rehomed or rescued from labs, or they're rehomed and rescued from zoos. And then the free living primates, they were either deliberately released for tourism, again, human gain, or lab trade purposes, or it's accidental escape from lab or tourist facilities. And now there is a small self-sustaining population of non-human primates, mainly based in Florida. What happens to them? You all probably know this too well. Primates kept and used in laboratories, most are killed. It's just part of the process, either as an integrated part of the experiment or just because they're treated as commodities. And as soon as they're no longer useful, the lab doesn't want to pay the costs of lifetime care. It's simply not factored in to financial and logistical planning. And there's very, very limited instances of rehoming to sanctuaries. And that number, 1,500 compared to 113,000, goes to show that. And usually rehoming is at sanctuary expense, something that we're going to be talking about. Those used and kept in zoos, they'll live in zoos until they die. Some of them will be rehomed very occasionally if a zoo's shut down through legal proceedings, or if a zoo chooses to end a particular exhibit of a species and rehomes them. But generally speaking, they will live and die in those industries that they're born in. Same with pets, they'll live their entire lives that way. A limited number will be rehomed to sanctuaries. We rescue more animals from the pet trade than anything else. And that will either be owner surrender or legal seizure. And then just an unknown number of monkeys and other primates will be killed when they become too dangerous to care for in a domestic setting, which is basically when they reach adolescence. Primate sanctuaries provide care until death. So we're dealing with animals who can live 30, 40 years. So that is a huge resource commitment on the part of the nonprofit sanctuary community. And again, this is a key factor in what we're talking about today. And then finally, free living primates, they just kind of get on with their own lives. They used to be captured for labs and pet trade, but current populations, after kind of an uproar about that, they've just been left on their own. So there is this kind of strange self-sustaining community which just kind of live out their lives in and around the US. All right, so this brings me to the 1,200 monkeys I want to talk about today. So the DOJ, as I say, contacted us to ask us if we could provide space for 1,200 monkeys, and the story gradually unfolded. In 2022, Charles River Laboratories allegedly imported 1,200 juvenile macaques from Cambodia. And I want to be clear here, these are babies. These are animals who should be with their moms. In early 2023, Cambodian officials were arrested as part of an ongoing US Department of Justice and Fish and Wildlife Service investigation for involvement in an illegal monkey smuggling ring. CRL was subsequently subpoenaed in the case, and it was alleged the whole crux of this is that the 1,200 monkeys, apparently their paperwork had been falsified, and that they were actually, rather than captive bred, which would have made their import legal, then they were in fact wild caught. Another thing to make very clear in this instance is that if you're dealing with 1,200 young wild caught monkeys, the amount of destruction and damage that that has caused to their natal troops is just unquantifiable. So the emotional distress, the mothers who have lost their babies, the troops who have just been fragmented because the young animals have been taken out. And also, generally speaking, if monkeys are being quote unquote harvested from the wild, many, many other monkeys will die because, like us, they will protect their little ones. They will try and fight and they will be killed. So we can't even estimate. It's not just the 1,200 baby monkeys who have had their lives completely turned upside down in this. There's probably potentially hundreds more monkeys who have also suffered the same fate in trying to protect those youngsters. So once it became apparent that it was illegal or allegedly illegal, CRL couldn't use the animals in testing. They weren't allowed to. But the options of what could happen next were really unclear. And so this whole saga began. So options basically threefold. All or some of the animals be returned to Cambodia for release into their natural home. And that seemed like a really great option on the surface of it. You know, they've just been taken, they could be returned back. We'll talk about why that isn't possible in a moment. All or some of the animals be killed. The terrifying thing is, even though Charles River cannot use them, they are still technically the owners of them, and the ownership is kind of a very gray area. So right now they're under the care, if you like, of the lab, and this is still a very real option that these animals could be killed. The third option is that all or some of the animals be rehomed to a sanctuary or sanctuaries in the US. So let's just explore those a little bit more. So the first one, they be returned to Cambodia for release into their natural home. Now, this is what we would love for them, but two things. The ongoing alleged government corruption, where this all started, and this goes to the top of the Cambodian government, means that if animals are re-exported, they will just be recycled back into the lab trade. The likelihood is they will be sent to a country with lesser regulations. So the kind of estimate is they may be sent to China. Even if there was an opportunity to release them and they be protected from that fate, then given that they're juveniles, they're 2 to 4 years old, they're babies, they're not part of a cohesive troop or troops, they will have been taken potentially from hundreds of different troops. A comprehensive rehabilitation and release program would have to be launched to better secure their survival. This would take years. There are neither funds nor land. And when we say the land that would be needed, because these macaques live in troops of between kind of 15 and 50 on the high end. and they will cover multiple square miles. So you couldn't just put 1,200 monkeys on a piece of land and expect them to survive, because the carrying capacity of the area wouldn't sustain them. So the likelihood is that they simply wouldn't survive if they were sent back. So that isn't an option for them. Second option, that they be killed. This is the absolute last resort. Right now, this could be their fate if we can't find sanctuary homes for them. And then finally, some animals be rehomed to sanctuary or sanctuaries in the United States. And this is where we kind of get into the cost of this. And the fact that we have to think about money over and above being able to save the lives and what we want to do is really difficult, but it's the reality. So caring for wild animals in captivity is a difficult task, and it's an expensive task to give them the kind of lives that they need. At our sanctuary, we have multi-acre enclosures. You'll see we're not supposed to have favorites, but this is my favorite. This is Darwin the baboon. He's the best guy I've ever met. And he lives in a 3-acre enclosure with his friends. He's got trees to climb. That is a standard that we set for ourselves. And so we would, if we were rescuing 1,200 monkeys, we would have to build multi-acre enclosures for smaller social groups. Now we have a 175-acre site, and right now that is more or less taken up with enclosure space for our 241 existing residents. If we were to calculate the care costs for 1,200 monkeys, we would have to essentially build a new sanctuary from scratch, and we would be looking at $125 million in infrastructure costs, in build out, in moving our existing animals, and in the care for almost 1,500 monkeys over the next 20 years, because they have long lives. It's eye-watering. It's just, it's an inconceivable amount of money. Even if funding was secured, the monkeys would have to be housed somewhere temporarily while build out occurs. And if you imagine if this became a case of legal seizure, then the government would need to put the monkeys somewhere after the seizure, so while we build out. So what we ended up coming back to, and this is heartbreaking, and we are still standing ready. If we can get 125 million, we will rescue those monkeys. But we came back to what we believe might be a more workable plan. We were initially approached about caring for one shipment of 360 monkeys, and that would cost about 25 million over 20 years. That is an eye-watering amount of money, but it's something that we feel we might be able to achieve for them. So we're really focused right now on the 360 with the hope against hope that we might be able to find a solution for the 1,200. However, here are our challenges. Okay, federal fine structure. So here in the US, there are a couple of laws where this illegality would come out. So where this, under which the company would be found liable. However, within that legislation, it doesn't allow the cost for lifetime care to be passed to the guilty parties if found liable. There is no legal mechanism to force Charles River to pay for the lifetime care costs. And the thing that is galling about this is that this is even if the liable party is a multi-billion-dollar company like CRL. CRL announced quarterly figures of multiple $billion. And there is no way for us to extract that money other than them doing it voluntarily to care for these animals. What that means is the majority of costs must be covered by the nonprofit community, individual donors and grant-giving organizations, which means that the 125 million right now, in our view, is just simply unobtainable unless we can get that pressure on Charles River to do the right thing. The 25 million is possible, but only with significant cross-sector and government support. So what are the kind of wider issues in this? When contraband lives and breeds, now laws governing illegal import or trade of goods often assume, or usually assume, that contraband is inanimate. So, you know, you have a shipment of stolen cars, you have a shipment of ivory, you have a shipment of bushmeat where the animals have already been killed, or dead animal parts. What can you do with that? You can warehouse the goods, you can destroy the goods. Nobody and nothing suffers if those goods are just shoved in a warehouse somewhere and forgotten about. But when contraband is living, breathing, and in need and lifelong care, there is no legal mechanism to support that. And the frustrating thing is that the laws governing illegal import and trade in wildlife really should have anticipated this. This is not a surprise that live animals are smuggled. The live animal trade is huge. So why those mechanisms were never included is a real fault of the legislation. And it has much wider impacts than just this rescue. So we're looking at Cricket Hollow Zoo. It was a zoo which was shut down. It was awful conditions. We rescued 5 monkeys from there, 3 baboons and 2 macaques. There are around 300 animals who were seized. The entire legal proceedings and the rescue were led and funded by the Animal Legal Defence Fund in 2020. Had they not done that, then those animals would probably still be there, because if you can't actually get to a seizure, if there's nowhere for animals to go, then these places are allowed to continue. So this was one example of it being led, again, by a non-profit organization who had to use its donors' funds to care for these animals. They actually funded ALDF the building of enclosures for the 5 monkeys that we rescued, and Born Free committed to providing the lifelong care. The Envigo case, which I'm sure some of you are well aware of, where 4,000 beagles were rescued from a lab as it was shut down in 2022. This was led by HSUS, another non-profit organization. And the beagles were all kind of filtered out through rescues and shelters throughout the US, and homes were found for all of them, which was just incredible. This is not an option for wild animals, because wild animals cannot be filtered out and live in domestic homes, so that those costs are dissipated among, potentially thousands of different individuals. The other thing about this, the kind of knock-on effect of the rescue of the 4,000 beagles, while that was incredible, what it did was it saturated capacity at the shelters, who otherwise would have been able to be bringing in and rescuing other dogs. So that the lack of government support and the lack of underpinning of the legislation during that seizure meant possibly that those spaces taken up by those 4,000 beagles meant that other dogs lost that space. And again, footed by the nonprofit community. Puerto Rico Zoo, 600 animals. Puerto Rico Zoo was closed down permanently just earlier this year. 600 animals required rescuing. The primary rescue partner in this is Wild Animals Sanctuary, yet another nonprofit. Big Cat Public Safety Act. This was a huge win for animal activists around the country. We'd worked for 10 years on this legislation, and it was introduced I think it was actually implemented in January of this year. And it banned the private ownership of big cats in the United States. The problem now comes is that there was no funding set aside for enforcement. So now we're at the point where the keeping of them is banned, but if any of these cats, a lot of them were grandfathered in, so that if you already had them, you could keep them, but if they're kept in poor conditions, they'll be confiscated. But again, there's nowhere for them to go unless sanctuaries once again provide the space and foot the bill. And we're going to see a similar thing with the Captive Primate Safety Act, which we're working really hard to see introduced, which would essentially mirror the Big Cat Public Safety Act and ban the keeping of primates as pets in the United States. So this just highlights the bigger problem, which is the already overburdened sanctuary community is asked to take responsibility for the failings of the hugely lucrative trade in wildlife, while those responsible for illegality, abuse, neglect, are never fully held accountable. And of course, we all know this. Ultimately, the very presence of non-human primates in the United States creates consequences for the animals. The ones who are lucky, they'll get a life of captivity in a well-run sanctuary, and that in and of itself isn't good enough. We do the best we can, but we're dealing with traumatized animals who have come from terrible abusive backgrounds. And I think one of the things that I always want to be really clear about is, while sanctuaries do such important work, because they value individuals and they give individuals a chance to live a life that is better than they would have had anyway. But sanctuary isn't the answer to this issue, because these are wild animals, their captivity is always going to cause them suffering. And I think a lot of the time the rescue of animals and their movement to sanctuary is celebrated as like the happily ever after that everyone wants for them. But really, it's just the beginning of a journey. We've rescued 8 monkeys in the last year from the pet trade. Some of them are doing well and they're integrating pretty well. Others are really struggling because they've never seen another monkey before. They don't know how to behave. They're stressed. They're scared. And that behavior will carry with them potentially for years. So sanctuary isn't an immediate happy ending. And that's kind of the best option they have. So the worst thing that can happen to them is premature death due to either that just being what was planned for them in the lab industry, a lack of alternatives, or honestly just a lack of care within the industries which exploit them to provide any kind of lifelong care for them. I hate the term retirement of animals from exploitative trades because I think it co-opts the language of the labs and the zoos and the pet trade, but they don't even think about that. What happens to the monkeys at the end if they're used to them is just like, well, that's not our problem, and they will just be killed. So the animals in these cases just always pay the highest price. So to conclude, and I think I've got through this quicker than I thought I would, so we'll have more time for questions. So in the case of the 1200, what we have to do is pressure CRL publicly to provide for the lifetime care of the monkeys. I want to talk a little bit about Born Free's position in this in a moment. We have to, in the long term, we have to create mechanisms in legislation, and that's not just in the US. So in the US, it's the Animal Welfare Act and the Lacey Act to provide restitution for animals caught up in illegal trade and welfare failures in industry. Now, this, like I say, this is not something just for the US. I worked for a long time in my native UK, and one of my focuses was animal law. Fines are never relative to lifelong care. This is not something that's provided for. So it's something that if there's anyone out there who works on legal issues, this is something that we can potentially work on together, because this is so important. We need to increase fines relative to the cost of lifetime care for individual animals. And the other thing that has to be provided is temporary infrastructure, because animals do not get seized if there's nowhere for them to go, and businesses are allowed to continue exploiting them simply because governments or local authorities don't have a means to take the animals anywhere. So they can't pursue legal cases, and they're just allowed to continue. I think those of you, if there's anyone there from the UK, I think I've got some former colleagues out there who worked on zoo issues with me. South Lake Safari Park in the United Kingdom is a great example of this. Hundreds of animals were dying. They were being neglected. There were terrible conditions, and the local council could not or would not shut them down, because what on earth do you do with hundreds of animals? There's no infrastructure there to allow them to be cared for. Now, in the long term, the presence of non-native primate populations, and this can apply to any wild animal species at all, must be phased out, because all of these issues are predictable. They're predictable, they're recurring, they happen in the US, they happen in other countries. Businesses fail, and the responsibility for animal care is shifted to the nonprofit sanctuary community, which is already overburdened. And then even with funding and infrastructure provisions available, there's just a limit to the number of animals sanctuaries can house. There's no world where 113,000 monkeys can be moved from the lab trade into sanctuaries. It's just not possible. And that would require, miles and miles and miles and miles of square miles of land. And that's just not something that is ever going to happen. So sanctuary, not just for the welfare concerns that I've talked about, animals continuing to have to deal with their trauma once they're rescues. Sanctuary is not a solution for this issue, not for primates, nor for other species. So finally, as it stands, we are standing by. We're still ready to provide a home for life for the monkeys, and I include the 1200 in that. If we can work out a way to fund it, if Charles River comes forward and stumps up the cash, because we know they have it, we have very little information on what next steps are. It's been very frustrating that even though we are the lead partner in this, we are the ones who will make this rescue happen. We are basically given information on a need-to-know basis. So right now we're being kept in the dark as to where the investigation is at or what step it's at, which makes it incredibly difficult for us to plan and fundraise. We are committed to providing a home to a minimum of 360 monkeys, as long as the funding can be secured, and we are so open to rescuing those 1,200. It would be a bonkers project if we were to go ahead and do it, but we're ready for it and we're willing for it if we can get the funding. But right now their fate hangs in the balance. How you can help. So contacting Charles River, we need to put pressure on Charles River to demand the monkeys are released into sanctuary care and that they are provided with lifelong funding. People working in the conservation sector have created a petition to add long-tail macaques to the US Endangered Species Act. That would make it much more difficult for them to be imported for vivisection. And the same group of people have done incredible work to get long-tail macaques listed by the IUCN, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature, I think it is, as endangered, which again is putting roadblocks in place for the people who are trying to import these animals. The other thing that, and this is going to impact kind of potentially if people have questions, some of the questions that I can answer. So I want to flag that PETA are also doing really great work on this. They have been our partners in this. And because we are directly involved with the rescue, there are certain things that we are not able to really talk about publicly. And as Born Free as an organization, it's quite difficult for us to go hard after Charles River Laboratories, because what we don't want to do is to ruin our chances with the government of being able to be the rescue partner. So we've been kind of tag teaming with PETA, and they've been able to be more vocal and active on the kind of activism and pressure campaign side. So I'd also want to recommend that if you want to get involved, check out what PETA are doing on this as well, because they're working with us. They also generously pledged $1 million to the rescue if it goes ahead. So with that caveat, I've shared everything I can share. I don't actually really have much more information than I've shared with you today, but there are certain things, confidentiality clauses that we've had to sign, which prevents me from speaking 100% openly. Everything I've shared today is already in the public domain. But I'd be really happy to answer any questions or just hear any thoughts or ideas that anyone has. If you've got any questions or you want to have a discussion, kind of a private discussion offline, here's my email address. Feel free to take it down. We're willing to do anything we can to rescue these animals. And I just want to flag the beautiful photos of the monkeys at the sanctuary. I didn't talk about all of them as we went through, but hopefully you enjoyed some of them. They were taken for us by the amazing vegan visual artist Ruth Montiel Aria. She's based in Spain. She does fantastic activism work, and she worked with us for free for 3 months last year and documented some of our monkeys, which we're really grateful for.